Kia ora, good afternoon, and welcome to this FSC Connect webinar, Climate and Sustainability, an International View, with experts from FTSE Russell, FTSE Russell. I'm David Bishop from the Financial Services Council and your facilitator for today's session. So welcome. Before I hand over to the team at FTSE Russell, we just wanted to touch on the work that the FSC is doing in this space. And climate is such a wide-ranging topic, and as many of us have experienced over the past weeks here in New Zealand with the severe weather events, climate and how it affects us is important, not only in terms of how we live our lives day to day, but also how we adapt and mitigate for the future in our business lives as well. And the financial services sector, as many on this webinar will know, New Zealand became the first country in the world to pass a law to ensure financial organisations disclose and ultimately act on climate-related risks and opportunities. And the FSC and its members have been responding to that and keeping abreast of the climate and ESG legislation through consultations and submitting responses on behalf of the sector. And alongside that, bringing together people from the fund managers, KiwiSaver providers, insurers and others to help create a set of common scenarios that can be used in assessing financial services firms' progress on climate-related issues. And watch this space for more work in this as it progresses. But globally, the world is reacting to climate change through lots of different initiatives, and such as the recent COP22 in Glasgow, and here in New Zealand, the government announced emissions budgets to keep global warming to 1.5 degrees as part of those discussions. So it looks like we're heading down a good path, but how are the rest of the world doing, and how do we compare? So by way of introduction to FTSE Russell, I'd like to welcome Head of Sustainable Investments for the Pacific, Trista Rose, and for Asia, Helena Fung, both joining us from Singapore today, and Head of Index and Investment Groups for the Pacific, David Ho. FTSE Russell has just about 20 years of experience in ESG and data, and provide models and data tools to help understand operational and product-related ESG risks and opportunities. So very knowledgeable team we've got with us today. They've got a great presentation. So please ask questions through the Q&A function at the bottom of your screens with a packed session that we'll try and get through to them. So ask some questions. And at this point, I'd just like to say thank you to David and the team and ask you to come and join us and start the session.
Thank you very much, David. So good afternoon, good morning all. It's David Ho here from the FTSE Russell, Head of Investment of IIG in the Pacific. So look, I won't take up a lot of your time today. Most of the speaking will be done by the experts on the panel in Helena Fung and Trista Rose. But what I would like to start off with is just give you an overview of who FTSE Russell is and where we actually sit in sort of the role that we play. So Esther, if you can move to the next slide, please. Next one. Thank you. Okay, the one after that. That's just a disclaimer. So that just means that anything that I say or we say that doesn't make sense, we're not really here. We're just a figment of your imagination. So let's just move on to the next one, please. Okay, one more. Great. So many of you may not be aware, but FTSE Russell is one of the largest index providers in the world. There's a lot of information and stats here to demonstrate just that. However, I'll just point to a couple of ones that I'd like you to just to focus on. So as of April last year, we have currently 20 trillion USD benchmarked to our indices. That's by and far the most amount of assets benchmarked to our indices for all indices from all the other index providers as well. In terms of ETFs, indices are more widely known to be the backbone of any ETF product that is available via, for trading and buying and purchasing. And we've currently got 1 trillion USD benchmarked to that. I mean, FTSE Russell is part of the London Stock Exchange Group. We're a large multinational organisation with 25,000 employees around the world, and we operate in 72 different countries. You'll get a copy of these slides afterwards if you want to find out more. Certainly, you can refer to this afterwards, but I won't spend too much more time on this. If we can move to the next slide, please, Esther. What this slide is pretty much saying is that at FTSE Russell, we are also not just a one-trick pony. We cover indices across multiple asset classes in multiple jurisdictions, and we can do a combination of each one of those, from global equities to fixed income products to real assets, as well as private assets as well. So we are, pretty much if there's a data set that we have access to, and that's clear, then we can certainly build an index over that. So if you move to the next slide. And of course, as David mentioned a little bit earlier, we have over 20 years experience in looking at ESG and ESG related data, as well as indices across the business that we have. We have data from over 16,000 different companies, over 175 countries around the world. We're currently, in terms of sustainable index assets under management, over 260 billion. And of course, knowing that data is very important, but we can't do this alone. We have also partnered with a number of international global firms below, including PRI, RIA, FSC New Zealand, of course, and Transitions Pathways Initiative. So look, I won't spend too much more time on this. As I said, most of the IP will be presented by Helena and Trista. So what I will do is now, without further ado, hand over to Helena Full. Helena, over to you.
Thanks, David. Good morning, or should I say good afternoon, everyone. I'm currently in Singapore, but typically based in Hong Kong. So I am head of sustainable finance and investment for the Asia Pacific region. I have been with the business for about 3 years, working across indexes, data and analytics, and we are very engaged in the marketplaces that we are active in Asia. And Trista will talk a little bit about what we're doing in the Pacific region shortly, but really engaged with talking to investors, talking to regulators, and trying to join the dots between the whole sort of financial spectrum of financial markets participants to really drive forward on the sustainable investment landscape here. Also bringing global best practices into the region as well. And I know that there are many of those emerging in New Zealand, that we do see some really positive movement in the Pacific region, and that what is happening in New Zealand is very much kind of on a par with what we're seeing in terms of developing global good practices as well. If we can move to slide 9, I'm going to really, I think, set the stage by talking a bit about what we're seeing in the markets, a little bit about what investors are asking us for globally, but obviously with a very sort of specific regional Asia Pacific and Asia in particular lens here as well, which is the way that we approach the translation of sustainable investment concerns and requirements for investors here is really taking, I guess, the very good work that's being done by our teams elsewhere, and then bringing that to help investors in the market to achieve their objectives around achieving good ESG standards, but also in particular, and this has been a key focus recently, around decarbonization as well. As you can see, there are 4 different parameters that are set out on the slide here. So ESG ratings or scores and indexes being a key focus as we're seeing assets transition away from carbon-intensive benchmarks and investment products and towards solutions that are better aligned with long-term sustainable investment goals. And we know that this is a marketplace that is becoming increasingly relevant, and that there are a number of different methodologies and approaches. And I think some of that we'd like to try and unpick a little bit for you this morning as well. On the regulatory front, as we'll describe, there are a number of different policy tools coming through from regulators in terms of taxonomies, in terms of banking standards, prudential and assurance as well. And obviously in insurance, regulators also now very much engaged on issues like physical risk. You've got a couple of different pieces of regulation that are European-led and driven, set out on the slides of the EU taxonomy and SFDR, which obviously approach 2 different criteria, but which are all part of the EU's Green Finance Action Plan, and which we see resonating also around the world, with different markets looking to apply these pieces of policy in different ways. We've got the creation of a number of different taxonomies here in Asia as well, which obviously then raises issues of interoperability and fragmentation across markets, with there then being a concurrent drive to bring regulators together and for the financial services industry to engage with global regulators as new standards emerge, and as we're seeing a lot of consultations come out in various markets to really try to stress the importance of interoperability, perhaps, but particularly where there are large global financial institutions who are trying to juggle with competing regulation or different regulation in different markets. Reporting frameworks is obviously a key area where we've seen a call for standardization, and you can see listed on the slide here the ISSB, the International Sustainability Standards Board, which has been created or mandated, if you like, by the IFRS Foundation trustees to come up with a globally relevant and applicable set of reporting guidelines that can then be implemented on at a regional level as well. And that implementation will obviously differ and will depend on the support of different regulators in different regions. And TCFD obviously helping to really draw together the notion of standards that should be universally aligned to different markets. And again, the rationale there being consistency and comparability of reporting across markets. And then the development of global goals and principles really helping to drive in many ways the standards. We know that PRI is probably the most significant investor body that has emerged to support the implementation of sustainability and ESG integration in the last sort of 15 or so years, and that also helps to bring together investors to make sure that they're engaging and aligned and really being active in the markets that they are that they have exposure to try and drive forward standards. SDGs and the notion of impact as well, also being very important there. And I'll mention the greenhouse gas protocol in the drive to, again, make sure that standards converge and that we have a common understanding in terms of reporting goals and frameworks, even on elements that may appear to be quite unified, like, for example, greenhouse gas emissions reporting and disclosure. You can go to the next slide, please. And this, I think, summarizes sort of the various ranges of different standards that we see in the market, but also the different focuses that some of these have. So if I go back to the ISSB and the intentions of the IFRS Foundation trustees to create the Sustainability Disclosure Standards Framework that we're expecting to be delivered at the end of the second quarter this year, the intention there is really to make sure that entities and the users of the disclosures are able to understand the financial applicability and the value drivers or risks that are contingent on the addressing sustainability concerns at different companies. And obviously they're starting with a climate framework, but it is really the drive towards making sure that this is deeply integrated within the financial reporting and analysis and can then be translated by investors. And again, goes back to the concern around ensuring that we have consistent standards across markets. And the other elements that I would call out as being important here are the ability to engage and to have full transparency as well. And we know that piece around transparency, predictability, and climate being a key risk are really important drivers here on the focus on sustainability reporting and disclosure standards. We can move on to the next slide. So as it says here, I think we recognize that capital markets are going to be extremely important in helping to reach net zero goals. We have some fairly lofty but very significant and important ambitions on a global basis to be able to achieve alignment, ideally with a 1.5 degree temporal pathway, and certainly in terms of the goals of the Paris Agreement to be less than 2 degrees. But what will be very important in this, and I guess the relevance and the point of all of this disclosure is really to help to shift finance towards more sustainable objectives that are going to help to achieve those very significant climate goals and objectives. So this is really about how you translate the data into underpinning the investment decisions that are made and the way that capital is allocated. And from a fund management perspective, specific disclosure requirements for financial products then becomes very important as well. And if we go on to the next slide. The three pillars that are supporting, as I mentioned earlier, the EU's Green Finance Action Plan are really around the disclosure piece through the SFDR regulation, which also helps investors to understand the objectives and parameters and exposures of different investment use cases and products. The green taxonomy, which many people will no doubt have heard of, which I mentioned earlier, has sparked really a plethora of different taxonomies emerging across the Asian region. As you can see here, there are 6 different objectives within that taxonomy framework, climate change mitigation and adaptation being the 2 elements that have been focused on in the first iteration, with biodiversity and ecosystems also being extremely important, and again, a core focus that is developing for investors, both in terms of understanding how they can use biodiversity frameworks to allocate capital, but also in terms of standards for disclosure as a next iteration, building on the pillars of the TCFD approach as well. We've also seen, and as an index provider, this is very significant to the work that we've done in FTSE Russell, the development of the EU benchmark regulation, which has created 2 different frameworks for climate indexes, the EU Climate Transition Benchmark and the EU Paris-aligned benchmark, being, again, a very important marker for investors as well in terms of understanding and assessing what investment products are intended to do, creating a line in the sand in terms of designation and a recognizable methodology that investors can then sort of draw, I think, some level of confidence from, because they understand what the product is intended to do, the fact that it meets with regulatory requirements as well, and the need to disclose and demonstrate that the specifications of the benchmark regulation are being met. Also, but I think the point about these 3 different pieces of policy that have been put out under the EU's climate action plan is that really they're all there intended to help the EU to deliver its specific objectives around climate, so to meet the net zero objective by 2050 or earlier. And this is also the way that we're seeing policymakers elsewhere approach the development of different policy drivers. Also, is really on a regional basis. What is it that they need to deliver, and then how can they support that through different pieces of regulatory frameworks as well. And then we go on to the next slide. I'll say a little bit on the US. So as we know, the US has more recently pivoted towards embracing a focus on climate, or re-embracing a focus on climate, and has announced a number of different supporting pieces of policy aligned with that. So starting in 2021 with President Biden's executive order on climate-related financial risks. And then last year in the first quarter, we saw proposals for mandatory climate reporting rules for listed companies, which included the delivery of Scope 1, Scope 2, and Scope 3 emissions, or the disclosure of those different levels of emissions. And we're now waiting to see also the SEC enact into law mandatory climate disclosure frameworks for funds as well. And then by next year, I anticipate internationally recognized ESG disclosure standards, again, applicable to all users. So it's really interesting to see this shift in the US. And also, I think the way that perhaps helps to drive and shape the global level of ambition. And I'm sure you'll be aware of different debates that have been sparked around what is happening in the US as well in terms of the green investment piece also, and encouraging those industries. If we move on to the next slide. I'll say a little bit here just on the NAIC, which is an example in the insurance industry, with insurers with premiums exceeding 50 million US having to produce an annual insurer risk disclosure survey in compliance with the TCFD framework. And we know that 15 states so far have committed to using this for companies in their jurisdictions. Obviously, a very interesting political framework there with different levels of ambition and activity in different states also. but really consolidating, I guess, the fact that the risks that we're trying to address through climate are relevant really across the spectrum of financial market participants, and that insurers are primarily exposed to that really in the front line and have already seen the risk to that from a capital perspective also. So they've been one of the earliest hit sectors from a physical risk perspective and translation into direct cost as well. If we go on to the next slide, which is China, and then I'll hand over to Trista to talk more on the Pacific region. China's a really interesting region. As I mentioned, I'm based in Hong Kong, so very close to China. And we do see, in fact, a lot of activity from a policy perspective in China as well. What's interesting about this is that it often goes under the radar unless you're really in the region and have access to the legislation itself. But China has been a leader in the creation of green taxonomy frameworks, was one of the earliest, in fact, with its green bond catalogue. And there are 3 different green industry standards in the market in China as well, really aimed at fixed income and at lending criteria. And we're seeing the banks in China having to report up to the PBOC on the level of green loans and green financing that they're making. Also really interesting that the green space and that climate as a global ambition is really helping to, I guess, get different countries and policymakers really working together. We've seen the US and China obviously leading the G20 workforce on sustainability as well. So a lot of activity actually translating into green flows. We see China is now, I think, installing the largest amount of renewable energy capacity, really making efforts to green its grid at the same time as tackling a very fossil fuel intensive power generation sector also. In Hong Kong, mandatory TCFD aligned disclosures are required for listed companies. There's a cross-agency steering group which brings together the Mandatory Provident Association, which is the pension fund system in Hong Kong, together with the FSC, the regulator, HKMA, the central bank in Hong Kong, the insurance agency as well. So a real drive actually towards creating standards, including for unlisted companies in the market. And that's something that in Hong Kong we have been particularly involved in. But I hope what this demonstrates is a global level of activity and ambition, and Asia really being very instrumental in that. Trista, I'll hand over to you, I think, at this point.
Thanks very much, and good morning, everybody. My name is Trista Rose. I am the lead for the sustainable investment effort for FTSE Russell and Pacific. I'm presently in Singapore, but I'm normally based in Sydney or Gadigal country. And before I start, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land. If we just move to the next slide, we might just go through what's happening locally. And really, I guess, it's kind of strange talking to New Zealanders about what's going on in the rest of the world, because, I mean, I would say that New Zealand really is leading the way in terms of climate standards. They're the first country in the world now to pass laws requiring banks, insurers and investment managers to report the impacts of climate change. And obviously, the 1st of January this year, the final standards of mandatory climate disclosures were published and they took effect. So really, it's a world leader. The standards, I guess, are aligned with the standards being proposed by the ISSB, and very closely aligned with the standards promoted in the Task Force for Climate-related Financial Disclosures. And more detail, I mean, while we have some detail about what the standards look like, more detail is expected to be rolled out later this year. So if we just go to the next slide. Just in detail, I guess, what the standards look like. Firstly, there's the NZCS1, which details the climate-related disclosure requirements of the 4 thematic areas, which map neatly with the TCFD requirements of governance, strategy, risk, management and metrics. The second standard kind of provides the framework for rolling out. There's optional adoption provisions, which companies may use, and details where there are exemptions with certain disclosures. And the CS3 contains the principles, the underlying concepts such as materiality and general requirements. So if we just go to the next slide. I guess locally, in Australia, this is this climate change rules in New Zealand, because I guess that it's going to apply not only to New Zealand-based companies, but foreign firms that meet the New Zealand $1 billion threshold, which actually covers the big four Australian banks. And I guess the companies in Australia have just kind of gotten under the radar from mandatory reporting requirements in the past. While it's been promoted that Australian companies align with TCFD, there's been no assurance or mandatory reporting requirements. So nobody can be really sure that what is being said is actually a reflection of what's going on. I guess with the introduction of the new government last year, things are moving very quickly. However, I guess we're trying to catch up with our neighbours. We had the net zero by 2050 enacted into law late last year, and just before Christmas, the Treasury Department announced that mandatory climate disclosures would be introduced, and that they were going to consult with the market on how that is going to look like. As of now, it looks like that it's only going to apply to the largest listed companies initially, and not enacted to next year, but hopefully with luck it will be in line with ISSB and look very similar to the New Zealand standards. So if we just flip to the next page, I guess the problem that's kind of propping up is that different countries and associations are coming up with all these different frameworks, and I guess there is a risk that there's going to be a mismatch of standards around the world, where investors are going to kind of face an issue where they're not really sure what they're looking at, and likewise, I guess financial issuers or unable to kind of assess what exactly companies are doing in each regional market. So I guess in response to this, back in November 2021 at COP26, the IFRS, the Financial Reporting Standards Board, announced that they were going to create this body called the International Sustainability Standards Board to kind of address this issue of mismatch of standards and create some standardisation which would protect consumers and I guess kind of the global markets. So the remit of the ISSB is to issue standards that develop a comprehensive global baseline of sustainability disclosure standards. So very quickly they've confirmed that they're going to issue its first two finalised frameworks by the end of June this year, and that they are hoping that companies will be aligned to these frameworks by 2025. So amongst these disclosures requirements, they've been quite ambitious. They have confirmed that Scope 3 GHG emissions will be a requirement, and that most countries' modelling standards off ISSB, there is an expectation that Scope 3 will become a standard that's included globally. So if I just flip to the next page, one of the other initiatives that's becoming quite a hot topic amongst the investment community and I guess amongst trade associations and regulators is this concept of biodiversity loss. So it's slightly veering away from the climate space, but no less important. A task force for nature-related financial disclosures was created, I believe, last year, which was created to address the problems of biodiversity loss, which I guess is a broader problem than climate change, but it's built upon the TCFD framework, and it's kind of designed to provide a framework for organisations and companies to report on their climate-related nature risks, and that framework is expected to be available by late this year. So if we just flip to the next page, I might pass back to Helena to talk about science-based net zero targets. Sorry, Helena, I think you need to unmute.
Thank you. Sorry, if we can put the next slide up. Thank you. I'm going to say a word now on science-based net zero targets, which we're really seeing, I think, shaping the level of ambition that individual corporates are bringing to the way that they are addressing the risk of climate change and trying to impactfully drive standards across their own businesses and take actions to decarbonize. I think the point of the SBTI, which is a partnership between the CDP, UNGC, the United Nations Global Compact, the WRI, which is the World Resources Institute, and the WWF, is to, again, a little bit like with disclosure standards, create a meaningful framework for businesses to try and set a specific way of reaching a 1.5 degree level of ambition and understanding how they can shape and change their own business practices to drive down global greenhouse gas emissions, and then to support that through the implementation of more localized country level NDCs or nationally determined contributions. So SBTI in many senses has, I guess, enabled companies to set out what their ambition is around decarbonizing within their own businesses. And then if we can move to the next slide, the way that is playing out in practice is through understanding what level of a budgetary allocation for the NDCs can then be allocated to specific sectors, and then down through into companies in those sectors understanding what the scope is for them in terms of needing to put forward credible and transparent transition plans on how to decarbonize their own businesses. And this was called for at COP27, as you saw in the previous slide, by Antonio Guterres last year. As well. And we do see, going back to the piece on global policy, a shift towards, particularly in the UK, all companies needing to present a transition plan, or certainly those at the larger end of the capital markets spectrum. So this is really something that's helping to drive, I guess, the science behind the theory. So to develop climate scenarios to stay below a 2 degree or 1.5 degree global warming scenario, and then that feeding through into global and sectoral budgets for greenhouse gas emissions to be developed, and understanding the amount of GHG or CO2 that can be emitted over a period of time, and that feeding then through into the development of robust standards and targets that will then help companies to manage their own emissions. So, as with many of these initiatives, we're seeing a lot of take up, and I guess have yet to see how that will transpire in terms of meaningful action. But I know that as a company, the London Stock Exchange Group we were the first stock exchange to make our own net zero commitment or pledge under the SBTI. So we have been through that process ourselves of understanding what that means and how we can translate that into our own business to decarbonize as well. If we can go to the next slide. So in terms of the sectoral target setting approach that I just mentioned, we are working very closely with the Transitions Pathway Initiative, which is, or otherwise known as TPI, which is an initiative that looks at a number of the more carbon intensive sectors. And you can see some of these set out here on the slide to understand the temporal pathway that those companies are on. And it's a direct application of what is known as the desectoral carbon reduction approach also. So helping to understand and inform a very sort of scientific approach for companies to be able to understand how they can then transition their own businesses. So we're seeing that kind of level of convergence coming through in this sense as well. And I think getting one step closer to understanding the meaningful impact of decarbonisation, but then also being able to take a more forward-looking view to understanding the decarbonisation pathway that different companies are on, and that then enabling investors to also take action within their own portfolios as well. Trista, I think you're going to talk about Scope 3 next, so I will pass back to you for that piece.
So I think now there's a broad recognition that for companies to reach net zero or truly zero emissions, that companies have to acknowledge all the emissions that they're accountable for. So Scope 3 emissions, I guess, relate to those emissions along the company's entire value chain, or those indirect emissions that are generated from sources that they don't control. So whether they're from their suppliers or from their customers. So I guess the philosophy behind it is that companies can't really achieve true net zero unless they take responsibility for all the emissions related to their activities. And I guess the importance of this is, or the importance of Scope 3 reporting is that it's essential for investors to assess climate risk and the true climate ambition of companies. So a reporting of Scope 3, I guess, enables investors to assess exposure to companies that have carbon intensive activities, whether they're the carbon intensive activities related to their own manufacture or own production processes, or the activities of their customers. So if you just want to flip to the next slide. So I guess reporting of Scope 3 is an extremely challenging concept, just due to the complicated nature of businesses. They might not necessarily know what their customers or their suppliers are doing with the product. And I guess there's a long-standing argument that it's not their responsibility, which I guess is an argument that's very hard to extend to the very highly polluted industries, particularly thermal coal mining or power generators. But nevertheless, it is very hard for companies to quantify their exposure. And it's particularly hard for small and medium-sized enterprises that just don't have the resources to employ reams of ESG and sustainability people to kind of figure it out. So this is kind of a concern that's been acknowledged in Australia and New Zealand. The Chartered Accountants Association has come out saying like some sectors are just sufficiently not mature enough to be able to make these disclosures appropriately and accurately. But as it stands in New Zealand, there has been a 1-year exemption provided for disclosure of Scope 3. However, disclosure is being encouraged. And given what the ISSB has said and the fact that the SEC has indicated that they will incorporate Scope 3 into mandatory disclosures, it's likely that this is going to become the norm. So if we just go to the next slide, like I said, the ISSB has confirmed that they will phase in Scope 3. There will be a temporary exemption allowing companies to delay disclosure for a minimum of 1 year when applying the standard. And what it means for science-based targets is it will define, I guess Scope 3 will define how much and how fast an organisation needs to reduce its emissions to meet goals of Paris. So I think even less than a year ago, this kind of felt like a much simpler target. Companies or sectors were allocated a budget to get to this 1.5 degree pathway, but now we have to kind of work out where exactly companies are in terms of their whole value chain. And I guess to decarbonise, the science-based targets are saying that within 5 years, the near-term science-based targets must include 68% of Scope 3 emissions if they make up 40% or more of their total emissions. So we might just go over and divert our attention to the global crackdown on greenwashing. I'll pass it back to Helena just briefly.
Thanks, Trista. If we can move to the next slide. So I'll talk a little bit about some of the more global initiatives here, or the focus on greenwashing that we're seeing coming through from regulators more broadly. And then, Trista, I think there are a couple of Australian pieces of policy that you might want to comment on here. I think the main one to call out really is going to be the EU SFDR regulation, which is probably, and I mentioned the sort of reverberation of EU regulation on a more global basis. I mean, we've been seeing that in being referenced in some levels of regulation here in Asia as well. But the SFDR essentially was defined to help to curb greenwashing claims. In many ways, you might see that as perhaps the focus on ESG investing as being very successful, and therefore needing to be better defined, and to ensure that the products that are labelled as green or as sustainable actually achieve the objectives that they have highlighted, I guess, on the description. So the point of SFDR really was to define sustainable investment as contributing to an environmental or social objective as assessed by particular indicators. There are now a number of different parameters that are quite specific, such as principal adverse indicators and good governance and concepts like minimum social safeguards that underpin that have then become more difficult, I think, for investors or asset managers, and even for I guess the producers of some of these products like ourselves to be able to assess and measure against. But it is really about understanding how you can classify particular products. SFDR itself creates two different levels and frameworks in the market as well, Article 8 and Article 9 products. And again, we're seeing that as really being very instrumental in terms of creating standards as well. And similar initiatives also in Canada, which has long been a key location for sustainable investment with some of the large asset owners there as well. And then also in the US with the SEC rules and requirements around ESG disclosure and also naming conventions. As you can see set out on this slide, there have been some very high-profile cases of greenwashing that have attracted some significant fines. So the regulators are, in particular, I think, seeing this as a key risk that they want to challenge to maintain the integrity of ESG-aligned products. But also it then becomes, I think, more incumbent on the providers of products and on asset managers to make sure that their products are doing what they say they're doing. I guess the other side to this is then what's being known as green hushing, where people or organizations are doing some good work, but are a little afraid to speak up about it for fear of not meeting some of the criteria that others might expect them to, or being scrutinized more deeply. So it's really about finding the balance in many ways. The other piece, I guess, as well, is the focus on ESG ratings and scores, and an element of regulatory engagement around that as well. But Trista, why don't I pass to you for the closer to home piece?
Yes, so pretty much after Australia announced that it was going to net zero, and all of these kind of climate initiatives were introduced by the new government, ASIC, which I guess is the local Australian regulator, and the ACCC announced that they were specifically going to target greenwashing. And in the last couple of weeks, we've seen a crackdown on that. Their authority, I guess, is coming from the Corporations Act, which prohibits false and misleading statements in relation to financial products. There's no specific ESG or greenwashing regulation. In the last 2 weeks, in a momentous case, ASIC actually has announced that they are suing the Mercer Pension Fund, accusing it of misleading members about the sustainability of investment options. And the Financial Review this week announced that 20 superannuation funds are under investigation for potential greenwashing. So I guess has the fund management industry a little bit on edge as to what might happen in relation to this. So if we just go to the next slide. So I believe after the crackdown in Australia, the FMA issued a statement locally reminding stakeholders that greenwashing is illegal. And the FMA recently undertook a thematic disclosure review into funds that incorporate non-financial factors into their investment decisions. That review called for fund managers to better substantiate their claims and noted that many claims were so high level or so subjective that they're of no value to investors. So I guess in New Zealand, the statutory obligations are set out in the fair dealing provisions in the Financial Markets Conduct Act and the Fair Trading Act that prohibits misleading or deceptive conduct, false or misleading representations and making of unsubstantiated claims. So I guess ASIC raised a series of questions for regulated entities, which is relevant for New Zealand participants. Specifically, a number of questions were outlined, which I guess important to keep in mind. Those questions were that fund or financial products providers need to be sure that the product is true to label, the terminology used is not vague, whether the headline claims are representative and they're not misleading, have sustainability-related factors been incorporated into investment decisions, is there reasonable grounds for stated sustainability target, and have providers explained how this target will be measured and achieved. So I guess Australia's increased regulatory focus on the area is just a strong reminder to market participants that they must ensure that statements across the whole spectrum of ESG are not only true, but they are substantiated. And I think that comes to the end of our presentation. We actually managed to do it right on time. I might hand it back to David Bishop from here.
Great. Thank you very much, Tristan, Helena and David. That's just really interesting. And wow, lots of things to think about and contemplate. I guess just to kick off the questions there, one of the questions that kind of struck me as I was listening is particularly with the LSEG experience in creating the transition plan, Helena, that you talked about. So what were the challenges you sort of faced in creating that plan, and where are you up to with it, and what can we learn from you, really, I guess?
Thanks for the question, David. What were the challenges? I guess we're such a diversified business, and we're global, and we operate in a number of different locations. So I think bringing all of that together into a unified plan is probably the most sort of difficult piece for us. And then rolling that out across the company, implementing specific guidelines for the teams to follow, making that meaningful and impactful in a sort of real world way. We're a financial services provider effectively, so we're not a carbon intensive business in our own right, but understanding how we can be aligned and where our footprint is, I think is probably the most important element. We looked at obviously the full spectrum of different risks and opportunities as well for the business. So that was also an important piece, but understanding where, we might be active in locations that are subject to specific physical risk was also something else that we did. And if you think about, data centers and where we have our assets located, or for us, it's mainly people and hubs, and how we might need to change those over a period of time. I think that was something else that we went through. But I also think it was an important process for us, because we're advocating for this on a global basis, that companies align themselves with a 1.5 degree, a 1.5 degree scenario. So for us, taking the leadership and doing that ourselves, and then also, I think more broadly, translating that through what we can do on the capital market side of the business, on the data and analytics side of the business. Beyond the SBTI initiative, we're also a founder of the Net Zero Service Providers Alliance, and we're therefore committed to, providing the products, tools, and services that are going to empower the financial services industry to then meet its own goals in terms of transitioning to a net zero environment. So we're looking at it from a number of different angles. But I think it was an interesting process for us to go through, and now it's really about, we have this, Trista said, 25,000 people, I think, globally, of which more than half of them are in Asia Pacific region. So how do you then make that meaningful and measure and follow up on a year by year basis, and make sure that you're aligned with the specific goals and the pathway that we should be on course with under our commitment?
Yeah, it's quite interesting, because as an international business, you're having to sort of deal with the different rules in different jurisdictions in some way as well, I guess. And actually comes to a question from Michael on the webinar here, just saying, how does, say, a major NZ listed entity with a primary listing on the NZ exchange gain secondary or dual listing, and how do they sort of manage doing multiple climate disclosures across different jurisdictions, I guess, is sort of the question. And what laws does it actually have to comply with? Is it in their own jurisdiction or the jurisdiction in which they're operating? Big question. Not sure how easy it is to answer.
I could jump in. A lot of, in regards to the dual listings, a lot of these mutual recognition of listing rules do exist between exchanges, and normally when there's a dual recognition of listing rules, they defer to the main listing venue. So that's
I think that the question is kind of highlighting the problem that investors have as well, really. They're kind of, most investors these days are global, they're not local, and they're having to navigate all these different standards. And I think kind of what we've demonstrated, and what is interesting to me, is that New Zealand really is leading the way I mean, we need to take New Zealand's lead, and standards need to be harmonised. I feel like in a way we've got to get the message out there. I mean, and it's certainly, it's interesting to us because, we can go out and talk about what's going on in New Zealand as an example, and we need it to protect investors, not only make it easy for companies to report.
And if I can add to that, the question exemplifies exactly what we've been talking about, certainly in the first part of what we presented, in terms of the convergence and alignment of standards. The reason why the ISSB are trying to bring this sustainability disclosure standard that will be market-wide, it will need to be implemented, as I said, jurisdictionally, but this is exactly the reason why, we need a convergence of standards to make it much more streamlined for not only the users, but also for the companies that are needing to produce produce disclosures. We know it's been, and the feedback has been very clear, that, having different standards in the market and the proliferation of different standard setting bodies has created its own level of confusion, but both companies and investors, as Trista says, operate internationally. So the convergence and alignment piece is really important.
I don't think we actually mentioned it during the presentation, but I did read there are now over 200 reporting standard requirements.
Wow.
It's not.
As an investor or a financial services provider, that's a lot to be able to try and get your head around. And I guess I have another quick question there around sort of the percentage of jurisdictions across the world that have got standards, and I guess that sort of answers a question. If there's like 200 odd different standards, that's quite a lot of different jurisdictions getting into this and getting up to speed with it, I guess.
There are only a handful that have mandatory reporting requirements. I guess most countries around the world are deferring to the TCFD requirement, which is being encouraged, not mandatory. And I'll just use the example in Australia. I believe 60% of companies are reporting in line with TCFD, but there is no... there is no kind of reporting requirement or legal requirement. I mean, there is no, I guess what I'm trying to say is there's no accountability or transparency around these statements. And if I can say something without saying something, the companies that started the initial reporters of TCFD were the large miners, the large mining companies and companies kind of in the energy utility space, who I guess wanted to promote, what they were doing in line with climate standards. But there is, I guess, the initiative of what's happened just before Christmas, that mandatory climate disclosures will be required, and there will be a body overseeing that going forward.
Sure, interesting. Just moving on to Scope 3, very interesting conversation around how the whole supply chain is kind of being taken into account. New Zealand's built on, I guess Australia as well, built on small and medium enterprises. And I guess the question is, how do we help bring those small and medium enterprises along this journey? Because they may not even be thinking about this sort of stuff.
Yeah, I mentioned we're doing a lot of work in that particular space, having, I guess, coming from or trying to broaden out the scope of of disclosures from the main listed companies, which is what investors have traditionally been looking at when they're considering, I guess, their ESG or climate exposures, to now understanding, and we talked about the banks, the insurance companies, the exposure of different sorts of financial institutions to climate and sustainability risk, and the fact that they are not only focused on the larger listed companies and that their client base or the exposures in their lending books, for example, if you're a bank, are going to be oftentimes to those smaller companies that you're talking about, David, and they have been neglected from a reporting perspective, not least because, of course, they're not subject or may not be subject to the same listing requirements of larger companies in particular in the listed space. And I think part of the element that's required there is certainly a capacity building initiative, and we're seeing, frankly, focus on that in many of the markets. I talked about the fact that we're very active in Hong Kong, supporting the regulatory initiatives, and there is a particular initiative that is directly focused at SMEs, at enabling them to report and to provide a disclosure framework for SMEs that is going to be applied via the banks typically. So training the relationship managers, training the smaller companies, understanding that there is, can be a significant part of GDP in their own right, have a significant collective carbon footprint, and that you need to bring them on that journey. As a business, we're also looking at the tools that are required. Calculating scope 3 is, or using scenario analysis, for example, is typically expensive. It's a heavy lift. It's done in a very manual, consultative way. We need to be able to make sure that those companies also have the tools available to them to be able to do that in a way that's scalable, achievable, and that they can, frankly, afford to do. It's a very good point, and one that is, I think, actively under consideration across a number of regions.
Sure, and it's going to, I guess, fall to the larger companies to engage and make that happen, I guess. Cool. Hey, we're just about out of time. Just one last quick question that I'll pose to all three of you, and it's the good old: where do you see this all being in sort of 5 to 10 years' time? In terms of, do you see lots of this sort of alignment with capital markets and the sustainability goals in a good position and in a solid place, or do you think it's going to take a bit longer than the 5 or 10 years? I'll start with Helena, since you're on.
It's a great question. Personally, I'm relatively positive about what we're seeing in the markets and the ability to shift capital, but I also think we have a lot of work to do. And I think that our global ambition of 1.5 degrees that we're, as we know, quite a long way removed from at this point in time. So I think it's really about, we've talked a lot about policy. It's not just about policy for its own, about disclosure for its own sake. It's really about shifting the capital that's required. And that has to be so many areas that we could have gone into, but from a blended finance perspective, in terms of shifting private capital, but also using policy and development bank capital as well to encourage that. We kind of need to move this discussion off the table and into actual transactions. So I am very positive, but I still think we have a lot to do as well.
Trista, your view?
My expectation is that countries are going to have to introduce standards, and I think Australia is a good example of this. I think even before we had a change in government, we were starting to realise, given all of our climate disasters, that if we didn't kind of act in line with the rest of the world in terms of climate goals and disclosures and so forth, that we would be ostracised from the global capital system, and that we would have quite a lot of difficulty raising debt and so forth, which is going to be particularly important if you're a country that keeps facing climate disasters. Yeah. So I feel like it's inevitable, I guess. Market forces will find a way to make this happen.
Yeah, sure. Cool. And David, did you have one last comment before we finish on that question? Okay.
No, not at all. Thank you. Just not like everyone to see my face.
Good stuff. Cool. Hey, listen, thank you so much. It's just really interesting to hear the global perspective. It's great to hear that New Zealand is paving a bit of a path in this area, and I think I hear lots of challenges ahead in lots of different spaces as we keep developing through this process, I guess. And just in terms of everybody on the call and FSC members, and Carissa and Heidi in the FSC team who've been working really hard on the ES climate and ESG submissions and sustainability activity, and around bringing all our members together. Thank you very much. Great questions, lots of challenges. If you want to find more about what the FSC is doing in the climate and ESG space, please head over to our website, and there's a good page of resources there for you. And FSC Connect will be back in April, where we'll be looking at governance. And then, of course, as well, we just launched our conference, which will be in August this year in Auckland, and that's titled Building Consumer Confidence. Again, jump onto the website, have a quick look, and we'd love to see you there. And in the meantime, thanks very much again, Trista, Helena, David. It's really interesting, and have a great rest of your Thursday. Thank you very much.